Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So it's been a few days since our last opinion video, and today is going to be different than usual. We usually just try to focus on the positive on this channel, and the reason is because I'm constantly bombarded with these blog, TO, etc. articles on Twitter and Facebook that are basically just, oh, the Ottawa LRT has broken down again. Oh, the TTC is closed this weekend. Oh, this project is delayed. Oh, this, oh, that. And I think what it really is it feels like just attacking transit instead of actually providing a solution or fix for the transit problems we face. These kind of posts are just punching down at the issues we have with our transit systems. And so we do try to be positive. However, I'm seeing a lot of issues across Ontario, and I thought, no, maybe this is a time for me to actually look at the problem, maybe try to diagnose it a bit, and then maybe propose a solution to a lot of the problems we're facing in Ontario. Now, if you're not already, consider supporting us on Patreon. We now have over 25 of you supporting us on Patreon, and it's super helpful. It's meant that we've been able to create videos more frequently, and we hope you're enjoying them. Now, to start with Ontario's transit problems, you need only look at the two biggest cities in Ontario, Toronto and Ottawa. The TTC has delays on a regular basis on both the Yonge and Bloor Danforth lines, and Ottawa's LRT has been facing issues since day one. Now, in the TTC case, I think it's just an issue of government funding. We've known for a long time that the TTC just doesn't receive much of a subsidy, and I think increasing it would be a great thing for the province to do, to try to get that backlog fixed on the TTC. In Ottawa's case, I think the government should kind of provide some backbone so that the City of Ottawa can go in and try to push Rideau Transit Group to provide better service, and if they cannot, have the government come in and kind of start a legal battle against RTG so that we can either get new LRVs or we can get the system fixed. Now, the next big issue I see is Presto. Now, beyond the fact that Presto is not a great system in the first place, it doesn't have open payment right now, there's a lot of kind of limitations to the system, Presto isn't even deployed Ontario-wide. While there are some systems that don't even have smart cards, Waterloo and Guelph have both got new smart cards that are separate from Presto. Now, I don't really think the government should ram Presto down the throats of these municipalities, but they should make Presto a super enticing option to use so that Waterloo, Guelph, and pretty much every other city with decent transit in Ontario moves to Presto. Having a single card in the entire province would be fantastic, and at that point, maybe it's time for Presto to start looking at intercompatibility with systems in Quebec. I know STO and Ottawa kind of have some intercompatibility, but Presto needs to be deployed across Ontario. The fact that we have multiple systems in the province is really inefficient and really unfortunate. So that's a huge failing of the current kind of transit infrastructure and government. The next thing I think is really important is new capital funding for the TTC. If you look at other cities across North America, it's shocking to see Chicago and New York are cities that are actually already pushing for new capital funding sources that have been inspired by places like Europe. Meanwhile, Toronto is basically not doing anything. Now, I've been in Ontario under two different governments, so to be honest with you, I'm not super happy with what either the previous Liberal government or what the PCs did on this. Toronto previously was talking about tolling the Gardiner Expressway, and the previous Liberal government shot that proposal down, which is unfortunate in my opinion. I think something like road pricing would make a ton of sense for funding the TTC. The reality is that so many people are driving, and yet they're not paying those constant fees that people riding the transit system are. And I do think that they should be funding improvements to the transit system in kind of a more substantial way. Transit actually benefits everyone by taking drivers off the road. Furthermore, the kind of tolling structure we have in Ontario is super weird as someone who isn't really from Ontario. The fact that Highway 407 is the toll highway and Highway 401, which is the obviously much more popular route and the one that cuts straight through the core, is very confusing to me. Making Highway 401 a toll route with some level of pricing, it doesn't even need to be a massive amount of pricing because of the amount of traffic the 401 gets, would be a great way to collect some new funding for the TTC. People have also discussed congestion pricing in the kind of downtown core of Toronto, and I think that's another great idea. Projects like the King Street Pilot have showed that we don't necessarily have to have tons of cars in the downtown core and that we can actually improve the streetcar network by doing so. So I think congestion pricing could be kind of a win-win on that. Now, the next thing that I think is really big is the lack of kind of big new victories on GO. While I am happy to see that GO RER is moving forward, it kind of feels like the bus was rolling down the highway under the Liberal government and the PCs have just taken their hands off and just kind of walked around the bus. what's going on. The fact that new station developments have been kind of canceled is really unfortunate. Now, of course, the official word from the government is that they're pending developer funding, but the reality is that stations like Liberty Village and St. Clair, where we're in dense areas of Toronto, they should be built immediately. They should not be kind of stalled until developers are willing to fund those stations, because we're currently deploying more and more service onto different corridors in Toronto, like Stouffville, Lakeshore East, Lakeshore West, Kitchener, as well as the Up Express. And not having more stations to bring more passengers onto these routes is just a big mistake. So what I think GO should be doing is building the stations up front and then making developers pay for them after in ways like tax increment financing, etc. Now, I do think for stations like Woodbine, it makes sense to say, okay, if you want to build the station, you got to fund it. But in these core stations, they should just be funded because they have a great business case behind them already. Another option that you could think about is something like what Vancouver has done with the Capstan Way station in Richmond. Basically, Richmond, the city, collected funds from all the developments going on around Capstan Way, and now they're going to build a new SkyTrain station for around $30 million based on those collected funds. So those kind of models could be great for Toronto as well. The next thing is the cancellation of the Hamilton LRT and the delays to the Eglinton LRT. Well, I definitely agree that the Hamilton LRT is not the highest priority in the province. The reality is that Hamilton could have really used the economic revitalization, and it would have been a great connector to the GO Transit network, having both the Hamilton LRT and the Mississauga LRT spurring up and kind of creating some new ridership on the Lakeshore West line. The Eglinton delay, while not super surprising, is just kind of a punch to Metrolinx that makes Metrolinx look less competent and less capable of delivering large projects, which is especially concerning given that they want to basically break records with the speed that they want to build the Ontario line in. The next big problem I have is the lack of movement on fare integration. In fact, fare integration has basically moved backwards under the current government because just recently the GO TTC co-fare discount has been ended. Now, maybe the government of Ontario isn't the one who should be funding these co-fare arrangements, but it is important for the government of Ontario to actually lead and show leadership here and create new models for municipalities and the government of Ontario to work together to fund these co-fare arrangements. And they need to be wider. Right now, having just co-fares between two agencies isn't really sufficient. There needs to be co-fares between all agencies, which means that fundamentally the whole fare integration model and the whole fare model for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area needs to be rethought. And unfortunately, all I've heard from Metrolinx and the province, including the previous government on this, has been study after study after study and no action, and it's a big problem and it's driving down ridership. Now, it's also really something I've noticed that everything feels super disjointed. We're also kind of going with the status quo, as I mentioned. While the Ford government did introduce the new Ontario line as well as a few new extensions, nothing is really new. The previous Liberal government was planning on doing some LRT extensions and probably funding part of the previous relief line, and those plans kind of got switched around and now they're going to the new plan that the current government wants to build, largely consisting of subways. The reality is, though, there isn't something drastically new here. One of those new things could be congestion pricing that helps to fund capital projects at the TTC, or you could have fare integration or a ton of new GO stations, but the lack of anything new from the current government is kind of disappointing in my opinion. And then I think finally, the big issue we're facing is the fact that there's not this kind of organization at a provincial level. As I mentioned, Presto isn't being deployed province-wide, there's issues in different systems, and there doesn't seem to be a single agency responsible for all of this. Metrolinx is kind of weird because it only applies to the Greater Toronto and Hamilton region, despite the fact that Ottawa now is a significant city with its own light rail system that probably could use some higher level management. You also have the fact that funding is kind of disjointed, with some areas getting very little funding and then other areas getting a ton of funding. I think the governance aspect here really needs to be rethought. There's one more thing I think the Ontario government really needs to do, and that's help fund Via Rail. Now, there has been talk of increased service to Southern Ontario and London with Via Rail, but what I think the Ontario government really should jump on is helping to fund HFR. Now, HFR would only be about a $4 billion project for the electrified option, and it would be so beneficial to kind of interlink it with GO RER. Currently, the two plans are basically totally at odds, with new proposed RER trackage and yards actually blocking the currently planned HFR route. basically bringing HFR into the fold of Go RER and kind of combining a lot of the electrification infrastructure, maybe some of the rolling stock infrastructure would just be really logical, and it would make a ton of sense, and it would benefit so much of Ontario outside of Toronto, which is something the Tories probably really want to do. So that's kind of the last major thing I think the Ontario government should consider. So how do we fix all these problems? Well, the first thing I'd suggest is a new operations and governance agency for Ontario provincial-wide for transit. Whether that's a reformed Metrolinx or a kind of a MTO being split with a transit-only agency, I think there needs to be something Ontario-wide that's pushing transit forward, working on fare integration, Presto, combining orders, because look, we're actually buying LRVs in so many different cities and they're mostly intercompatible. Why don't we bring Ottawa into that as well, and then we have even more scale that we can order new LRVs and trains on. Next up, as I said before, increase funding for the TTC via road pricing or other models. The Ontario government doesn't even need to manage that. It just needs to give the City of Toronto the power it needs so that it can do it itself. Another thing the Ontario government could do is fix fare structures. They could say, now that they're basically totally in control of the fare systems across all the GTHA as well as Ottawa, as I said, bring Waterloo, Guelph, and a couple other systems in, and then work on a provincial-wide fare structure. There's no necessarily a reason that Kingston transit should be cheaper than transit in Brampton, etc., etc., etc. The government should make transit largely kind of equitable across the entire province, and then bring in things like congestion and distance-based pricing. Now, congestion pricing could make a ton of sense, especially for Go. Maybe increase pricing during a certain window, like 8 to 9 o'clock. Same with the TTC, but then bring off-peak prices way down. Because you have more riders in that peak period, you could actually take a slight increase in peak period fares and then distribute that into a much bigger cut into off-peak fare prices, which would be great for ridership, especially on Go Transit. And finally, I think the Ontario government should look at new ways of funding transit stations while still building those transit stations. Just saying we're going to wait until developers are willing to build us every different Go station that needs to get built is just not a good proactive model. We need to go build the stations, and then when developers want to build projects right on top of stations, right next door to stations, then charge them for it. Anyways, guys, that's my thoughts on the status of Ontario and why it needs better transit leadership. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, have a good night.